So for this week, we'll be discussing Come Follow Me, Doctrine and Covenants sections 41 through 44. And the subtitle is Receiving the Law of the Lord. So this phrase, receiving the law, comes from section 44, I believe. And it says, and by the prayer of your faith, ye shall receive my law, that ye may know how to govern my church, and have all things right before me. And I will be your ruler when I come. And behold, I come quickly, and ye shall see that my law is kept. He that receiveth my law, and doeth it, the same is my disciple. And he that saith he receiveth it, and doeth it not, the same is not my disciple, and shall be cast out from among you. For it is not meet that the things which belong to the children of the kingdom should be given to them that are not worthy, or to dogs, or the pearls to be cast before swine. So the ultimate question for this video is on why does the law matter? And also we're going to talk more about what the Lord means by his law. But one of the things I want to point out before we get into that is this idea again of worthiness. And I know it sounds like I'm beating a dead horse, but I think it's really important that we understand this principle. And as you see here in verse 6, it says, it is not meet that the things which belong to the children of the kingdom, and in last video we talked about who the children of the kingdom are, that is the sons and daughters of God. So it's not meet, or it's not proper, it's not fitting that the things which belong to the sons and daughters of God should be given to them that are not sons and daughters of God, or that are not worthy. And so what we again see here is that your worthiness is tied to your obedience, especially if we understand who the sons and daughters of God are. If we go back to last week, we learned that to be a son and daughter of God means to be born again, and that comes from being obedient to the Lord, and it's an ultimate expression of submission, complete submission to the Lord. So those who are born again, the real trigger, I would say, is for those who have completely surrendered their will to the Lord. And that is an act of obedience, it's an act of faith, but it then makes someone worthy, because then what they will receive from the Lord will be received. What the Lord gives to them, they will receive, and they will use to further God's purposes. So now that we have that out of the way, I just wanted to point out once again in the scriptures where it says that about worthiness, and clearly shows in verse 6, at least in my mind, that there is a difference, not there is a difference, but that worthiness is tied to one's obedience, that not everyone is just worthy by virtue of being created by God, but worthiness comes by those who have become like the Son and who have taken the step to be born again. So with that preface or preliminary idea out of the way, let's now turn again back to receiving the law. And so he talks about receiving the law, and he says that those who receive the law become the disciples, those who don't are not his disciples. And so the question is why does the law matter? Well, in verse 3 gives us the answer. The law, and we'll talk more about what this law is referring to specifically, but just broadly, the law, the commandments of the Lord. He says that the law will teach you how to govern the church and have all things right before God. And that's where I'd like to turn the focus on, is this idea of having all things right before God or before me. So rightness refers to conforming to truth in the Webster's 1828 dictionary. And so thus, what is being said here, or you could say the logic, is that the Lord's law results in having all things right. And having all things right means that all things conform to the truth. And this is why those who receive the law are the disciples, because disciples of Christ conform to truth. Because as we know from what Christ has told us, he is the truth and the light. Christ in his character is the personification of truth. If you want to see what truth is in a human form, you go to Christ or to the Father. Um, and and maybe I should say a more accurate way is in a corporeal form, form involving flesh, is you go to the Son and the Father, because maybe people might think mortals, humans like us, and separate from God. That's why I phrased it that way. But I could just be overthinking that. In any case, so the disciples conform to truth. But what happens if we don't receive the truth? Well, we're cast out. And it says in there, section 41, it says, "He that saith he receiveth the law and doeth it not, the same is not my disciple, and shall be cast out from among you." So the Lord is pretty clear that if you don't receive the law, then you can't be a part of him, and he has to cast you out. And what this also shows is that the Lord sometimes has to cut people off from other people. Now, the question is why? I imagine that some of you might be thinking, well, God is all loving. Why would he cut people off? Doesn't he want people to come to him? Isn't he a God of love? Isn't he always extending his hand to us, inviting us to repent? It seems kind of harsh for God to then want to cut us off. That doesn't seem very loving. Well, one of the reasons why God cuts people off is to avoid what I have termed corruption. Now, one example of this, and I'm sure maybe this example came to others as I was talking about avoiding corruption, is the idea of weeds. Now, the scriptures talk a lot about weeds. They talk about the wheat and the tares, right? And how the wheat is to be, the harvesting of the wheat is to be held off until the tares are fully grown, so then they can be separated. But when we understand this, or let me go back. The idea of weeds and the use of weeds in describing sin and wickedness is really apt. Because if anyone's grown a garden, or even more so, if anyone's just had a home and has had to take care of the landscaping, you'll know that weeds are constant infestation, and they can seemingly grow out of any environment, even the worst environments. So with a vegetable, you have to have the right soil, you have to have the right pH, you have to have, nitrogen, all those components to creating fertile soil. But weeds, man, they can grow up. They can grow out of anything. They can grow in the sidewalk or in a crack in the sidewalk. They'll sprout up. I mean, they grow everywhere. It doesn't matter the condition. It could be dry for who knows how long, and the weeds will still thrive. And it's amazing how resilient they are, and also how invasive they are, and how difficult they are to get away or to get rid of them. And so there's that one component there, is that weeds are just everywhere, and they're noxious, and they are a lot of work. And so we remove the weeds because they are a problem. And so I have an example, and this goes to my landscaping of my yard. And last year, we have kind of an area of our yard that has a lot of weeds. And we're aware of that. And we, went out in the spring and pulled the weeds, and we did our best to get rid of the weeds that were there. And we did a pretty good job. But the problem is that we didn't follow up on it. And so as the summer went, the weeds started to grow more and more. And due to, I guess, my focus being elsewhere or whatever it may be, I did not stay on top of the weeds, and they grew enormously big, and it covered the entire backyard. And removing them was an absolute chore. And it was so many weeds, I had to get a trailer and take it to the dump because that's how much infestation there was. And so the idea then goes back to cutting off is, and it's not a perfect example because sometimes the Lord lets, the weeds represent the wicked. The Lord lets the wicked grow and develop with the righteous and doesn't immediately get rid of them. But eventually, you have to get rid of the weeds. And if you don't, if it gets too much, if it becomes too much of a problem, then it overpowers, it overcomes the yard. And that's the point is I had it kind of contained and then I didn't. And after that, it spread over everything. And it was going up through the garden beds and it was going around the garden. I mean, it was covering everything, and to the point where you had mice hanging out in there and it was just becoming an absolute disaster. And in order for me to protect my yard and also my garden, I had to remove the weeds. And so it's the same thing with the Lord is the reason why the Lord cuts off the wicked is because if he didn't, it would end up corrupting the good. And this is exactly what the scriptures teach us. So Paul in Hebrews talks about how he's telling the members to watch out, no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many. So he's drawing definitely on the agrarian imagery of of vegetation growing and growing up, a poisonous one growing up, or a poisonous root that is then killing the entire plant. Another one in Proverbs 22, drive out, and the Hebrew word can be translated as divorce, right? Separate the mocker, someone who rejects wisdom, and out goes strife. So what Proverbs is saying, if you get rid of the mocker, the person who rejects wisdom, the strife goes away, and quarrels and insults are ended. And I think a lot of us can relate. I think a lot of us have experienced being around people who are cantankerous, curmudgeonly, who are difficult, who are contentious, and who just by their very nature bring people down. And this is one of the things the Lord, if he's seeking to create a society of peace and harmony, has to remove. And so if people don't adhere to the precepts he provides to bring about a good and harmonious society, then he has to remove them. And this is what Paul says in Corinthians. Your boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little yeast leavens a whole batch of dough? Right? A little bit of bad can destroy the good. And this is something, again, that we see over and over again. And it's also documented in sociological studies regarding employment and how certain employees, poor performing employees, can bring down high performing employees. And then in Isaiah, this is from the Jewish Study Bible, it says, and when the scoundrel is spared, he learns not righteousness. In the place of integrity, he does wrong. He ignored the majesty of the Lord. So again, this idea again of, you could even think in a place of integrity, what would be a place of integrity? Well, heaven is a place of integrity. Zion is a place of integrity. What God is ultimately trying to do is create a society of integrity, of uprightness. And so if a scoundrel is in that society, the scoundrel will take advantage of the goodness of others and do wrong and then remove that integrity from the society, remove what the society is about. And we actually get a further example because when you remove the bad from the good, then prosperity can occur, not incur, occur. And we see this example most plainly in the Book of Mormon, where Alma the elder has to regulate the church. And it says, after Alma regulated the church, there began to be peace and prosperity. But the question is how did Alma regulate the affairs? What did he have to do to bring about this peace and prosperity? Well, in the other verses preceding verse 37, it says, "And it came to pass that Alma went and judged those who had been taken in iniquity, and whosoever repented of their sins and did confess them, he did number among the people of the church. And those that would not confess their sins and repent of their iniquity, the same were not numbered among the people of the church, and their names were blotted out." And so what Alma did is he did like any good gardener. He went through and said, my garden is not prospering. That is, the church is not prospering because we have a lot of rotten apples. I'm mixing my metaphors, but scriptures do it too. So anyways, we have a lot of rotten apples. We have bad wheat. We have weeds that are sucking out the life of the vegetable plants. They're taking over, fighting for resources, so to speak. It's my garden's not succeeding. So I need to remove the tares or the weeds from the garden. I need to remove that. And by doing so, I can allow the good to flourish again because the wicked were overpowering and they were using their bad example to lead others astray. And I'm pretty sure it says that earlier on in Mosiah is how the example of the wicked members of the church caused others to go astray. So the church was not prospering. And by prospering, it probably means in a lot of ways. It wasn't growing. It wasn't growing in both number of members, converts, but more importantly, it wasn't prospering in terms of knowledge, of becoming more like Christ, of becoming sanctified. Probably was halted because of the examples of the wicked. And so Alma had to remove those wicked members. And once he did, the church began to prosper exceedingly. And they began to have peace again, right? The contention from the weeds in the garden, by removing the weeds, that contention was gone. And they walked circumspectly before God, receiving many and baptizing many. So we kind of get an idea of what that prosperity looks like as I further read it. It was baptizing, it was receiving many, and they could do that because they were serving as an example. They were a light unto the non-members, and the non-members then had a reason to at least investigate the church to see what it was all about, because they saw something different than what they had. But they couldn't have done that is the church, unless they got rid of the bad apples, because the bad apples were spoiling everything else and they were giving a bad name. And so the idea that is being conveyed here then is we need to remove the wicked. And the ultimate reason, should I say, for this is because of God's end goal. And God's end goal is Zion. And you're going to start seeing this more in Doctrine and Covenants. So we've already seen a lot. And if you go back to the other sections, God is talking about Zion often, because what God was intending to do with the early church, believe it or not, was to create a Zion society. And that was really the focus of the restoration, was getting people the opportunity to establish Zion, because Zion is a place where happiness flourishes, where God's purposes are fulfilled, where order is established out of chaos, and where God has servants that can go forth to those outside of Zion and further convert, right? Because Zion is almost this hub for God to use to then reach out to others. And again, God tried to do that with the Israelites. He wanted them to be a kingdom of priests so they could be an example to the nations, and by that example, bring more people unto him. So that's essentially what God is doing. He's in the business of saving souls, and he tries to maximize that. And one of the best ways to do that is through examples. And if he has a righteous city, a city on the hill, as Jesus talked about in his Sermon on the Mount, the city on the hill, or city on the hill, it's a city that is set apart, that is unique, that people seek to because it's different, because they want it. They see a juxtaposition between their lives and the city and the inhabitants therein, and they want to be a part of it. And so this is from Hebrews. I didn't include it, but this is where he says, he's speaking to the church, Paul, he's reminding them of what the ultimate aim is. It's not just simply going to church and going through the motions, it's working towards establishing the city of Zion. He says, for you not come unto the mount that might be touched, that is the Mount Sinai, but you are coming to Mount Zion, and unto the city of the living God, and the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels, the general assembly of the church of the firstborn, and to God, judge of all, and the spirits of just men made perfect. Right? So he's saying you are preparing yourselves when you were born again, when you became a member of the church, when you and when you became a member of the, they say the church in the New Testament, when you did those things, you did it because you are now coming unto the establishment of Zion. That's what God's always about. At any time, he is always working towards this. And that's because it will be the uniting of heaven and earth. It's the uniting of people on earth with those in heaven who are just men, that is, justified men who have been sanctified, made perfect. That's who we are uniting with, and we unite because we are like them. And so, going back to this idea of the law, what the law actually is referring to is not just any commandments, but he's talking about receiving the law of consecration. And that's the law that he's now saying that if you don't abide by the law of consecration, then you're cast out. And that's because the law of consecration is either the law of Zion or it is a precursor law to get to Zion. Um, in any case, it's a necessary condition. Without the law of consecration, there cannot be Zion. And so the law of consecration has the temporal stewardship component, which is really interesting because in there, what we learn is that the wealthy are to then give back what they've earned to the bishop in his storehouse, and then the bishop divides that among others who aren't as wealthy. And it's this idea then that the people in Zion don't work for own personal profit, but they work to achieve wealth so then they can share with others. Because the idea is that everyone hands over property, it's then given back as stewardship by the bishop, and each member has a stewardship based on their needs. And then with that stewardship, they go and it's like the parable of the talents. They have certain talents and they are to invest, so to speak, in what they have, the assets they have, the resources they have. They are to invest and to improve upon that. And there will be, based on people's natural abilities, intelligence, people will separate themselves. Some will do really well and some not as others. And so then what happens is the people who do really well will give what their surplus, what they don't need, back to the bishop, and the bishop will then redistribute it to those who need it. But what's also going on here, so that's the temporal element of law of consecration. And I mean, I guess that is a law of consecration, temporal. But there's also a deeper principle, which is of what I call a spiritual stewardship. And this refers to bearers of light. Because what's ultimately going on in the law of consecration is that the strong are bearing up the weak. And the strong are giving of themselves to benefit the world. And this gets to a bigger idea of how God works among us. And that's where I'd like to turn and devote the remaining time to. And to understand this, we need to talk about the tree of life that Lehi saw. Now, I have another video where I go into more detail about this, but I don't know when I'll get to it, given that I'm doing these series on Come Follow Me. And it's a really important principle that I think should be shared, at least briefly, at this time, to give people an understanding of how God works, and by doing so, understand how they can come to God and the type of being they worship. So in Lehi's vision, we know that there is a tree of life, and that tree of life represents the love of God. But we also know that so we think that's the love of God is just the tree of life. But what we don't realize is that the tree of life the love of God is also represented by another symbol. And a lot of us might miss it. And that symbol is the living waters. And it says in verse 25, it says, "And it came to pass, I beheld," this is, I think, Nephi, "the rod of iron, which my father had seen, was the word of God, which led to the fountain of living waters, or to the tree of life, which waters are a representation of the love of God. And I also beheld the tree of life was a representation of the love of God." So we got the tree of life, represents the love of God, and living waters. Now, where are these waters located? Well, they're located by the tree of life. They're a fountain that extends out from the tree of life. And then we learn from Lehi, I did not include the chapter, but I'm pretty sure this is Lehi. It says, "I beheld a straight and narrow path which came along by the rod of iron, even to the tree by which I stood, and also led by the head of a fountain, unto a large and spacious field, as if it had been a world." And so this is actually where we learn that this river of living waters comes from the tree and then extends out into the world. And so what's going on here? Well, first of all, often the depictions of the tree of life looks like this. And this is generally okay, but what's missing are the living waters. Right here is a solid path. We do have the the filthy waters, but that's different than the living waters. This is a more accurate representation. Is you can see the waters right here. So you see the rod, the tree. You have the filthy waters down here, but you also have these living waters. This water that's flowing out from the tree, and then we learn goes out to the world, and the world represents the um, the field represents the world. So what's going on here? Well, what you're seeing is that God's love is the tree, but the waters represent the radiation, sorry, not radiation, but the radiating of that love out to others. And so while God's love is contained, well, not contained, but while God's love is centered, the tree of life, it's the living waters that flow that love out into the world. And now the question is how is God's love being flown out to the world? And the answer is his servants. So it's God's servants. God's servants represent the water. The water represents love, but a deeper thing going on here is that the servants are the water. The servants are the ones that are spreading forth God's love to the world. And so one reason why God needs righteous servants or righteous sons or daughters is so that they can then manifest his love to the world, because it comes in degrees. It comes to what people are willing to receive from God. And so God uses his servants to the varying degrees that they're at to then manifest his love so that the world can be benefited by the love. And we get this even in our life today. We may not realize it, but God has put bearers of light into our lives to share the love of God that they're aware of. And so by doing so, you're able to receive a modicum, a piece of God's love that you wouldn't receive any other way. And so in the next section, we're going to talk more about how, well, I think that's where we're going to go. I'll see where this ends up going, but I think what we'll do is talk more about how do the righteous share and spread forth his love. And one of the ways we're going to look at it is through the practice of intercession. And how does intercession work? And how does that allow God's servants to spread his love?